What a great room full of great people. How did we get so lucky to have all of you in this room at the same time? Thank you. For those of you who were here last night with us, thank you for your contributions. Thank you for your energy. Thank you again for your advocacy. And we just have so many more of you today. It is just fills my heart. So thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to just do some thank yous and then turn this over to Dr. Mikalakis to do some opening remarks. But again, I want to thank Catherine Randall for all of her wonderful logistical work. I probably should introduce myself, shouldn't I? Yeah, well, I'm Candace, and I have the privilege of working with all of you in different levels for different projects. But I've been around for quite a few years in healthcare, 45, 30 in the position I'm in now with the State Hospice Organization. So one of these days, one of you will probably take over, and isn't that exciting too? So I just consider it a treat to have worked with you. That's enough about me. So thank you, Scott Fish, Jason Carey, gentlemen up at the back who tend to the wires and the pictures and the technology, because thank God I'm not doing that. Somebody said, Sam said to me, and Sam too, who was with the university, Sam said to me, Candace, are you going to run the AV? And I said, I don't touch anything with wires. Nothing at all. And I would like the planning committee to please stand up. Jane, up. Jane Conrad. Everybody else. Lauren, Elizabeth, Kathy Amston, wherever she is. No, hiding. Yep, well, everybody contributed to what we are doing today and what we did last night. So I can't thank everybody enough. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We hope it's a wonderful day. It's filled with wonderful speakers. You'll meet all of them at one time or another. If you have any questions, go to Jane. Jane will tell you where to go and what to do. Yep, she will. And so it's always nice to have a director of floor logistics and geographics of this building. It's so big. So our sponsors, I'd like to thank them too. And why don't you hold your applause until I read the list. The posters are up around the room, but we have the Maine Health Access Foundation, the Bingham Program, Ames True Value, Martins Point Healthcare, Northern Light Home Care and Hospice, AARP, Community Health and Counseling Services, Maine Center for Palliative Medicine, Insight Corporation, Androscoggin Home Health Care and Hospice, Hartley and Benson Webster, Alzheimer's Association, the University of Maine Center on Aging, Maine Medical Association, Maine Cancer Foundation, Maine Health, Drs. Lauren and Chris Mikalakis, Dr. Jim Van Kirk, Cross Insurance, and Dr. Norfleet. Let's give them a round of applause. So now I am not going to take any more time. I am going to introduce a friend and colleague of mine that I've worked with for many years. She had the sense to come to Maine from Buffalo. Sometimes she's regretted it, I'm sure, but she's still with us. Dr. Lauren Mikalakis, her passion and her advocacy for palliative care the way it needs to be, end-of-life care the way we hope it will be, is second to none. People in this room, you all recognize the importance of advocacy. Sometimes we do it against all odds. We get so much pushback, but we do it because it's the right thing to do, morally, ethically. It's what we need to do. It's why we went into healthcare, and it is the right thing for our patients and families, which is first and foremost. So Lauren is going to grace us with some welcoming remarks, but I think we are going to have a lovely woman by the name of Kelly Neptune play some amazing music, including Amazing Grace. So Kelly was... Kelly tried to teach me how to play the native flute, and I gave it my best. I wound up giving my flute to the men in the Native community at the Maine State Prison. I got permission to do that. So I don't have one anymore. But if somebody said to me, well, if Kelly can't make it, are you going to stand in for her? I go, no, you wouldn't want me to. So Kelly was on our board for a while, and I love her dearly, and she plays beautifully, so please enjoy her. You may steal it.
Good morning. This morning, I woke up just before the sunrise and chose to sit and watch the sunrise this morning and watch the sun light fire to the sky. And I was in awe. I sat there with my beginner's mind as if I was seeing it and feeling it for the first time ever. And that's what really fills me up these days, are those moments that I allow myself to have. And so as I play this morning for you, I'll invite you to do the same, to listen with your beginner's ear and feel with your beginner's heart, and let yourself be a child in that moment as if you're hearing it and feeling it for the first time. And thank you. Oh, there we go. My mic wasn't working. And I will play this version of Amazing Grace, where Candace mentioned it, and I did it last night. And again, what I'll invite you to do is to pay attention to how the music affects you, not just mentally, but physically. Music has an amazing effect on us and can be a great source of healing. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
It's a beautiful way to start the day. I think we should start every day with a beginner's ear and a beginner's heart. That's how we should start our conference today, don't you think? So here we are at the inaugural statewide palliative care conference, the first event co-sponsored by the Maine Hospice Council and the Palliative Care and Quality of Life Interdisciplinary Advisory Council. As Candace mentioned, we had a very, very vigorous planning committee. Only a couple people stood up, but there were a cast of thousands, right? No less than 1,000 people participated. And so, we're very, very proud of this event that we're presenting today. Certainly, we were affected by COVID. I think we started talking about this 3 years ago or something like that. So we were sort of delayed, but not deterred, or certainly defined. We think our conference today represents a sweep of what's happening nationally, as well as some of the highlights of some things that are happening here in the state of Maine. Hopefully, it will become clear as the day unfolds that we've been pretty busy, that in spite of masking and distancing and getting used to the way we all look on computer screens, we've actually been moving things forward. We have, many of you who work in your programs have certainly done a lot to...
Adjust this for the camera.
Oh, okay. You've been doing a lot to move your programs forward, right? Maybe some things in spite of COVID, but maybe some things because of COVID. We certainly have legislation to be proud of. We mentioned this last night, LD 1064, an act to increase access to palliative care within the state. And Candace and her activities, we continue to push on with education and advocacy, and you're going to hear more about this as the day unfolds. So the cornerstone of palliative care is relationship, and I don't think that's something I need to spend a lot of time sort of talking about in this particular crowd, but I thought that in trying to set the stage for today's conference, it might be important and helpful to spend some time reflecting on the role that relationship has, both on the nature of the work as well as the sustainability of our field. Relationship is about the intimate spaces between human beings. It's about the shared experiences that embody the interconnectedness between all of us. We all share common worries and fears. We share common hopes for our families and our futures. And at some point, we all face the uncertainty of our medical challenges as we try to shade ourselves from the realities of our own mortality, right? Which is ultimately the great struggle of the human condition. The creation of a therapeutic relationship requires that we be present. It's about intimacy, engaging in the suffering of another human being, being unafraid of that intensity, being willing to experience the full spectrum of emotion that exists in that person's space. The fear, the profound sadness, the uncertainty, but also the gratitude, the love, and the beauty. It's always fascinated me and astonished me that all these things can exist in the same moment. Many times, it's the palliative care clinician, the palliative care team that first shines the light on unrecognized pain and suffering, while sharing pieces of themselves, pieces of their own humanity, to facilitate the healing of another when cure is no longer possible. Palliative care clinicians do this every day, and sometimes it's at great peril to themselves. Which really gets us to the second point about palliative care and relationship, and it's that this is very dangerous work, as many of you know, and it cannot be undertaken alone. The relationship with others outside of that, with the patient and the family, are so critical to the health and resiliency of the individual palliative care providers and the overall sustainability of palliative care as a medical specialty. So while the creation of therapeutic relationships with our patients and vehicles is really a vehicle for our work, it's really the supportive, caring, and understanding relationships between palliative care providers that is ultimately contributing to the best possible outcome for our patients. To me, that's what today is all about. Although I know we have a mixed crowd today of palliative care providers, advocates, and family members, this event, to me, is really in honor of and in celebration of the palliative care providers and teams who persevered, stood tall, and never wavered in their commitment to the patients and families during these challenging times. I personally thank you and honor you. You carry within you the palliative care, the heart of palliative care, and the essence of this work that I have loved for most of my professional career. Palliative care with its focus on relationship, real person-centeredness, and the achievement of the best possible quality of life is the core of what ails healthcare today. Within the principal tenets of palliative care, there's a crosswalk that can be accessed as healthcare systems deliver on their promises for high quality, equitable, and compassionate care. Palliative care is part of the solution as providers and systems trying to find their way back after COVID. There are elements of palliative care that can provide a template for all of healthcare delivery. It can provide the soul of our healthcare system. So I now have the privilege of introducing our first speaker, Dr. Betty Farrell. I hope you will all take a minute to read her beautiful bio. And when you do, you can see that she's accomplished, she's brilliant, and a leader in her field. She's been a nurse for 44 years, which I can't believe, which means she started when she was 2. Her present title is that of Director of Nursing, Research, and Education at the City of Hope in Duarte, California. She's a fellow of the American Academy of Nursing, has over 370 publications to her name. She's a principal investigator of the End-of-Life Nursing Education Consortium project, ELNEC, which many of us are familiar with. She was a co-chairperson of the National Consensus Project for Quality Palliative Care, our Bible, right? She has a master's degree in theology, ethics, and culture from Claremont Graduate University. In 2013, Dr. Farrell was named one of the 30 visionaries in the field of palliative care by the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine. And this is just a sampling from her bio. She has one of those bios that when you read it, you can't help yourself but to say, what the heck have I been doing with my life anyway? I also found myself wondering, what does it take to be a visionary? So last night's session, we also had the ability and the opportunity to hear some beautiful music from Kelly. And most of us heard Kelly's beautiful notes and felt just a bit more relaxed, a bit more centered, a bit changed. But here's what Betty said last night. She said, I heard the music in my ears, then I felt the music in my soul. So maybe that's what it takes to be a visionary. The willingness to hear a sound, the openness to feel that sound, and the courage to let it touch your soul. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Betty Farrell.
Good morning. I'm going to adjust the equipment here. 1 second. Okay, a miracle has just happened, right? We think it works. Well, thank you all so much for inviting me here. As I was listening to Candace this morning, I've always thought Candace is my soulmate and a great kindred spirit. And you mentioned this is your 45th year in your profession. And this spring, I celebrated my 45th year as a nurse. And I wake up every day of my life and say a prayer of thanks for every day of that 45 years that I've been a nurse. And so it's days like today that I'm really reminded of one of the many blessings of a career is friends and relationships, as you just heard. And so I'm just really grateful to be here. I was asked to talk about spirituality, and what I'm really going to be doing in this first segment today is kind of a twofer. I'm going to do two presentations, and that is because I wanted to originally, I was just going to share our work that's more focused on spirituality in adults, but in coming to Maine, I realized I could not possibly be in the same room as my friend Greg Burns and not talk about spirituality in children. And Greg has also been a wonderful friend and colleague and inspiration to so many people because of his daily work of caring for children and families. So I am going to start by sharing with you some work about spirituality in children. And then from there, we'll shift gears and I'll talk more about some of our current work in how to integrate spiritual care in everything that we do in hospice and palliative care. So as I start with this component, the work that I'm going to share with you is actually with two of my colleagues, Vanessa Batista, who has recently moved from Philadelphia to Boston, and she's now overseeing all the pediatric palliative and hospice care across several hospitals in Boston, and Gay Walker. And Gay was the really grandmother of starting pediatric hospice in California through Trinity Kids. And so a few years ago, Vanessa and Gay and I got together and we were talking about the fact that we really needed to do more about spiritual care in children, and that there was much that we could learn from children and their families to help us improve care. And so I decided today to start with sharing this work from the children, because what I'm going to be sharing with you is stories of children who have died in hospice care. And I thought there is no better way to start a day like today than to let these children be our teachers. And so I hope that you will also just listen and love these words and stories from children. So again, just to tell you a little background about this, I sat with my colleagues Vanessa and Gay, who are wonderful pediatric nurses, and we decided to collect stories. And so we collected stories from around the country from nurses who had cared for children, and we invited them, tell us a story where spirituality was important in the lives of these children and families as they were dying in hospice. And so we collected all these stories, and we analyzed all these stories, and we wrote up these stories to share. And then as we were getting ready the first time to put these stories together to share them in a presentation like this, Gay said, in Trinity Kids, we have this wonderful art program where the children in hospice all participate in, creating art. And so maybe it would be nice, let me get some of that artwork, and maybe it would be nice to kind of share that along with the words and the stories. So then the art came together with the stories. So I'm telling you that because when you begin to hear these stories and see this artwork, it is beyond amazing to see how the stories and the words that were not at all a part of the art are really very much a reflection of the stories and the words. It's really, really beautiful. So the artwork is created by these children, the true experts and teachers, and these are children that were cared for by Trinity Kids Hospice, and so we're so grateful to them. So all of us in this room, whether you care for children or in your daily practice or you don't care for children in your daily practice, we all everywhere in our communities, in our churches, in our schools, and wherever we are, we talk to families who have lost a child or who have a seriously ill child. And we know that caring for seriously ill children is a spiritual experience. It's a spiritual experience for the child, for the family, and for healthcare professionals. And also, there's been a lot of great literature that has documented the spiritual needs of children and families, and often these needs have not been addressed. We, as nurses, decided to focus on this work because being at the bedside across all settings of care and providing the opportunity to address spiritual needs. I want to share with you this definition of what is spirituality. And so, again, I'll say a little bit more of this in the second half, but this definition of spirituality, I'll tell you more about the history of how it came together, but this tells us spirituality is the aspect of humanity that refers to the way individuals seek and express meaning and purpose. It's the way they experience their connectiveness to the moment, to self, to others, to nature, and to the significant or sacred. And so, as we always say, some of my patients happen to be religious, but all of my patients are spiritual, right? Some of us in this room may have a religious affiliation. All of us in this room are spiritual beings. And that spirituality comes to us in the form of watching the sunrise this morning. It came to all of us together in community as we listen to the beautiful music of the flute. It comes to us in many, many ways in our lives, but we are spiritual beings. And children also experience spirituality, within their eyes, within their lens to the world, whether that be, the meaning of their lives is, playing with their sibling, it is the meaning of home, it is, nature, it is, the birds in the sky. But spirituality, all children are spiritual beings. There was wonderful early work in pediatric spiritual care. In 1998, a subcommittee of the Children's International Project on Hospice and Palliative Care began to improve the care of dying children by encouraging research in this area. So Betty Davies, some of you may know that name, was a wonderful leader in the 90s, early 2000s, that said we should be thinking about spirituality in these children. And one of the subgroups decided to create guidelines for spiritual assessment. So this work has been with us since we began. I know in my own entree to hospice, when hospice began, because my career started before there was hospice and before we knew the word palliative care, but that was one of the things that really drew me to this field was, wait a minute, this is care that includes spirituality? that this is what we do, an important part of our work. There's also been wonderful work, Fowler's faith development theory, in children, faith, and spirituality, that in the same way we think of children developing, cognitively or physically, children also develop spiritually in their own recognition. And I love these words by Mueller, that children may be conscious or unconscious participants in a spiritual life. Their presence alone provides spirituality to the world. And any of you who have cared for children in your settings, I'm sure you would agree that you went into the home to see this child, but as you were leaving the home and getting back into your car, you realized you were the person who was changed because what you learned from this young child. We also know that children have a great spiritual curiosity and spiritual needs. And I want to just pause and sort of tell you my own interest in this area. Probably close to 30 years ago, I thought I was doing a study on pain in children. And we set out to do this study, and one of the hospitals that I was working with was a children's hospital. And so I went to this children's hospital to interview parents to ask them, what is it like for you to have a child who's having pain? And what can we do to help better manage your child's pain? And so I sat to talk to these parents, and I was asking them about pain. I was not asking them about dying. I was not even asking them about spirituality. I was asking them, tell me what it is like to have a child who is having pain. So the first mother I interviewed said, I'm so sleep deprived. I stayed here all night. I'm about to go home to relieve my husband so he can come here. This was a child who was in an oncology unit. And she said, the craziest thing happened last night. She said, I got here and my child had been sleeping a few hours, and she woke up and I said, how are you doing? Are you okay? And she said, my daughter said to me, Mom, there were angels in my room. So I thought, oh my gosh. Again, I'm thinking, wrong answer. Like what? I'm asking you about pain, right? So she said, there's angels in the room. I'm thinking, okay. So I said, and of course, I'm thinking, wow, how amazing and how comforting, peaceful this may be, right? So I said, and what did you say? And this mother looked at me and said, I told her, there's no angels in this room. Okay? You are here with me. We're in the hospital. I'm your mom, right? Okay. As you know, I was having chest pain about that, right? Like, oh my. Well, what was the mother saying? The mother was saying, my child is having pain. Her disease is getting worse. And now she tells me there's angels in the room. Oh no, I'm not ready for that. The next interview, I sit down to talk to a father, and I said, tell me what it's like to have a child in pain. And the father said, my son told me that there was an angel that brought a ladder to the room, and he said he was coming back and that I would go up the ladder with him to heaven. And I said, and what did you say? And guess what the father said to me? No ladders, you're not going anywhere, right? So, and that was the study, right? The study was that when we sat to talk to parents about what is it like to have a child in pain, what we heard from parents was intense stories of children having spiritual experiences and parents who were not ready to hear about those spiritual experiences, right? And so that was our work to be done, right? So there's been wonderful work in this area. Kubler-Ross's early work in the 1970s identified the butterfly as the image used by many dying children, that other people have studied children's spiritual curiosity and seeking meaning in their lives. And all children, both healthy and those who are seriously ill, have thoughts and feelings about prayer, God, a higher power, meaning in their 12-year-old life or whatever it might be. And so we listen to the stories. We listen to the stories of the children, of the parents, and of the nurses. And we try to then learn, what is this thing that we need to tend to about this spirit? This, again, some wonderful work. Summer, who recognized dying children's spiritual needs to be loved and to love, to know that God loves all people and is not punishing them, that what lies ahead is positive, and that they will be remembered. And unlike physical symptoms, which are visible, a dying child's spiritual distress is harder to recognize and treat. And so if we don't enter these homes and rooms ready to invite the story, ready to listen, ready to not be the ones to say there are no angels in the room, then we will support the children in seeking their spirituality. And so again, an angel by one of the children. A child's spiritual needs obviously to be assessed in the context of the parents' and family's spiritual care needs. And often we have found that it is the child that children may have a very distinct belief in God or a higher power, even though parents don't have a religious affiliation. And so, of course, it's really important for us to be very respectful for the family and the parents, to help them be able to listen to the stories of their children, even though their spirituality might be different. And that we always want to think about children as whole spiritual beings. This was a child dying around Christmas time, and so you see, integrated within, Santa and all of the things happening in life, Santa and angels in the same picture. Also, we know that in terms of spiritual care, the care of the parents is so important, based on Feutner and Mack's early work of spiritual needs of parents of seriously ill children. They found huge needs to study in palliative care programs. And also how parents of children with serious illness use religion or spirituality or their life philosophy as a way of coping with this reality of having a child whose life is limited. We also know that with the increased diversity of patients and families that we serve, it really requires us to pay attention to a wide range of cultural and religious and spiritual factors. And so we need to be very respectful of Native communities, of people, of immigrants, of diverse communities, so that we understand and respect their spirituality. Spiritual care is essential to any patient-centered quality care. And our failure to respond to these needs really will impact the person's illness and symptoms and death. So you'll probably hear me say this again in the second half in our work with adults, but my mantra repeatedly is, if you are not providing excellent spiritual care, you are not providing palliative care. Dame Cicely Saunders in 1970 did not say, let's create a system where we give a lot of morphine, right? She said, let's revolutionize the healthcare system so that we see people as whole people. And that means psychological and social and spiritual needs. So we all have to live into this challenge of how spirituality becomes a part of our daily work. Again, you've heard reference to family, and we know very much in our fields of hospice and palliative care that our care is always focused on the entire family. There is one person with the illness diagnosis, but there is a whole family experiencing, and that is, of course, more true than anywhere when it comes to the care of children. I'm going to share with you a few stories about spiritual communication with children. Again, this comes from the work that I did with Vanessa and Gay, where we invited nurses who were providing care as their full-time work of caring for seriously ill and dying children to just share some of the stories with us. And so these were collected through our LNET courses and through work with the hospice. So these are stories from the nurses talking about their experiences with the children, and then the artwork comes from the children. So this is a wonderful quote from a nurse who said, I remember working night shift at the bedside on an adolescent unit. These teenagers were often alone at night with their nurse as company. This was often the time when these kids asked the big questions about God, faith, their place in the universe. These kids had an extra element of time limitedness to their questions. In teaching nurses in ELNEC, I always say, who do we send to work on the night shift in the hospital? The new graduate, right? What is the most important time in the life of a patient? The night shift, right? When no one's around, there's no one poking them, there are no tests, it's dark, their families at home. And so our night shift nurses prepared to hear the stories of dying patients, whether they're adults or children. So again, you heard the words, you saw the words of the nurse, and this is a picture of a child in saying the most important time is being in the hospital at night, watching stars, thinking about, where this child would be in the universe. This I love these words. This was a nurse who said, children and their families who have crossed what I like to refer as the thin gray line, that almost imperceptible line between worlds, the place where we leave one and enter the next, a permeable membrane, a place of passage, an open door, a fraction of an inch. I have learned that each child's spirit takes that step. And another nurse who said her job was to help them across the river as gently as we can. How many of you in the room do work with children? And how many of you just at that moment thought about a child and that moment where you knew that child's spirit had taken that step, right? And this, a picture from one of the children. How beautiful to illustrate this child's heart was taking this leap to a new place. And the sign of peace in between as the child crossed over. The next theme that we found was this discussion by children about Jesus and angels. This nurse shared, there's much to tell about dreams, those of the children, the parents, the grandparents. Several times a child has told me that they almost went to God or Jesus, but came back. They met grandparents, friends, siblings, some they did not even know had existed. Again, I see some heads nodding because you know these children and their stories. The children who awake and ask their mother about, the relative that they were never heard of before. Kira is the only 5-year-old I know who has ever asked for a harp for her Make-A-Wish. According to her parents, her heart's desire was to be able to play like the angels. She got her harp. Her parents told us the first song she wanted to play was Amazing Grace. She learned it quickly. I would venture to guess that she knew her time was precious. Again, this is the story of Garrett, was a 14-year-old when we met and had CF. He weighed 40 pounds, an adolescent in his mind, a small boy in his body. Garrett loved trains and had a pretty awesome set of tracks going on throughout his home when we first met. As he became less mobile, the train set got smaller, his sphere of influence diminishing room by room. When Garrett was bedbound, the tracks went around his bed, and when he lay dying, he had the caboose in his hand. All other evidence of the train set was gone at Garrett's request. When his mom asked, why the caboose and not the engine, he said, I'm the engine. I'm leading the way. I'm saving you the caboose so you can follow me later. This is a nurse who shared, she had told her daddy she was so very tired because they all wanted to talk with her. It was a little rude, she thought. She was trying to rest. But in her dreams, she was carrying on lovely conversations with her friends on the other side of things. She felt that she should not tell her parents yet what they were saying. Then one evening before her death, she awoke. Daddy, Daddy, can you see it? It's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. I feel like I'm floating just like they told me I would. This is fun. Her father looked up to the ceiling and said softly, I don't know who you are, but I think you are here to help my daughter not be afraid through this process. Thank you. Please take care of her. This is the story I'm going to share with you now is my very favorite story. And I happen to know this nurse who is telling this story. And it has a real meaning for me because this was a story about a patient in Los Angeles. And this particular child was homeless. It was a homeless family, and the mother had disappeared. And so left behind was the father, this young girl, and a young brother, literally living on the street. And the hospice then became involved, and the only housing they could find, this is in a very, very poor, not safe section of Los Angeles, was actually an empty garage. And so the father, dying daughter, and son were living in an empty garage. And the nurse was doing a home visit as this child was dying. And much of her interaction with his father had been that he was a Latina man and Catholic, and his distress when the nurse really, we go into the home like, I know all about your suffering, right? I know everything. And so she approached this, father saying, oh, your sadness, your suffering is because your daughter is dying. And the father was really clear in saying, no, my sadness is that my daughter doesn't have a mother, right? Her mother left. And in this Catholic, deep Catholic faith, to not be held by the Blessed Mother, he said, was just the worst thing that could happen, worse than the cancer, right? So the mother, this nurse is now called out at night because the father thinks maybe this daughter's dying. So the nurse is saying, Maria's dad had prayed many prayers to Our Lady of Guadalupe as he was so grieved that Maria didn't have a mother in these final days. On the last evening before she left us, it was difficult. Symptoms were escalating. She needed holding and bathing and loving. Dad asked me to do these things. He asked me to pray the rosary with her and continue in prayer until she died, which seemed moments away. I had never prayed a rosary in my life, so I asked Dad to pray, and I would repeat. He spoke mostly only Spanish, and I don't speak Spanish. But amazingly, I could understand what he was saying and repeated that rosary so many times. He was finished, but sweet Maria was still with us. He went to check on the younger brother asleep in the back of the garage. Without thinking, I began to sing hymns to her, rocking her, keeping her safe, weeping for her, wiping her forehead with a cool towel, telling her all would soon be well, and that she was not alone, the angels were coming. Dad came back and stood gazing at us there on that small old couch. He too began to weep. Madre, Madre, Maria has Madre. In the moment, I thought he was referring to the Lady of Guadalupe for some reason. Then he softly said, you, Señorita, Maria's Madre, glory a Dios. I love this story for so many reasons, but the reason I really love this story is the nurse was changed in the process of delivering spiritual care. And that is what happens in our hospice and palliative care programs. When we really integrate spiritual care, when we ask people, are you part of a religious community? Is faith important to you? Is your faith seen in the sunrise or the changing colors of the trees? Is your spirituality when you can, once again go touch the water and think of the boat that you used to be able to go out on? when we ask about spirituality, not only are our patients transformed, but we are transformed because we are reminded why we do hospice and palliative care. And the nurse concluded saying, I believe we are often the answers to someone else's prayers. I was not just Maria's nurse for that little time. I was an answer to her father's prayer. What holy work, right? And every day, if you do this work of hospice and palliative care, you should be reminded this is holy work. It's sacred work, right? Every time you open a door to walk into a home or a patient's room, you should be reminded you are walking on holy ground. Who doesn't like an angel in a shopping cart, right? This is a lovely story of a Vietnamese family. The Truong's parents were extremely anxious to take him home from the hospital. They spoke halting English, as the Vietnamese was their main language, and let the team know they had to get him home now. When I went to assess his condition and speak with them, I realized that transport home was going to be too traumatic because he was very near death. They were aware he could likely die on the ride home, and that could make his last moments more difficult than being here in the safety of the hospital, but they wouldn't hear of it and began to pack his things. They were taking their child home. But he was still with us when we laid him in his own bed. His symptoms hadn't changed, had not only changed, but escalated. I began to do all the technical things, hook up the oxygen, prepare the meds. The father came into the room. I was soothing Truong with some gentle touch, and he asked me to stop. Oh dear, was there a culture side I had not even been thinking about in the flurry of things? I stopped, and his mother entered the room with a beautiful single pearl in her hand. I stepped aside. They gently covered him in a saffron-colored prayer robe, and after lighting the incense, began their chants. They were not crying. They were now not distressed and not nervous. Lastly, they placed the pearl in his mouth. It was just a little while until Truong left. I returned the next day to their home. They were almost serene. They were so grateful that I had gotten their son home. Had they not placed that pearl, they have one for each member of the family when their time comes, he would not have had passage to get to the other world that is waiting, and he would be wandering aimlessly for the rest of time. They believed they could not have performed these rituals in the hospital because no one was listening. I will never forget the lessons they taught me. As an example, no ICU nurse would ever let an infant die in a bed. We believe that it's every baby's right to die in someone's arms. If it's not the family member, a nurse will be that someone, and I believe that is our ultimate expression of our spiritual care of neonates. This is an example of some of the great work happening in palliative care around the country, is going into hospitals and really transforming what happens when children die in neonatal ICUs. We've also begun to do some wonderful perinatal work through LNEC in the last year or two because of now the growing genetic testing and the number of families who learn that a child will die soon after a birth. And so the ability for hospice or palliative care to work side by side with the obstetricians to support these families. These are a few stories of spiritual communication with families. Dad was a very large black man, very angry and being labeled as the difficult parent. We were finally able to converse with him about his goals, fears, beliefs. His true spirituality was voodoo. We facilitated his speaking with his mother in Jamaica for spiritual support and counsel. He softened to be a big teddy bear and was able to be with his family, to be present. One experience I had in the hospital was when a very young couple came into the emergency department bringing the small child in their arms who had diarrhea for the last 8 days and was in respiratory distress. The child was wrapped with a blanket and had several types of leaves on her. I asked, why is this? And the couple responded, they took their child to a bush doctor. The child died about an hour after admission while still being evaluated by the pediatricians. The relatives regretted not bringing the child earlier to the hospital for medical attention. The issue of forgiveness comes up often with parents. We had a 21-year-old drug overdose in our ICU. His mother had no idea he used. We were able to locate how he injected drugs, but they were not noticeable to his family, friends, and teammates. He was a football player. We showed his mother his thumbs he was injecting under his fingernail. This is when forgiveness began. As his friends lined the ICU to say goodbye, his mother apologized to the staff for denying that he had used and had overdosed. After his friends cleared, his mother told him she forgave him for what he had done, told him it was okay, and within minutes he went systole and without us having to withdraw treatment. The decision she knew she would have to make later that evening, needless to say, there was not one staff member in the ICU that day did not have to go to the break room for a moment. And what is our role in providing spiritual care? This nurse said, my role, listen, reflect, listen some more. And of course, prayer, lots of it. I was on call and a mother delivered her newborn by a physician on call, not her regular OB, who left the room upon delivery. Upon review of the records, the child had congenital anomaly incompatible with life. She had seen genetics and nephrology and was aware of the prognosis. When I spoke to the mom, she was crying and cradling her newborn. Though she knew, she was obviously unprepared, so I also called the chaplain to prepare this mom to say goodbye to her newborn. Together, the mom, the chaplain, myself, and the pediatrician prayed and cried together. Her usual OB was not there, and since the prognosis of illness was dismal, she had not chosen a pediatrician. We all prayed at the bedside, held this mom and baby, and I witnessed the child's color turn ashen gray so slowly. So many wonderful things happening in hospice and palliative care with legacy, with handprints and photos, and all of the lovely things that can help really serve these parents for the rest of their lives. Attending the death of a 4-day-old child, mom's belly was anointed by a hospital priest prior to the baby's birth. At time of death, the family wanted the baby anointed. It's 1 a.m., 2 hours to the nearest rural town, minimal chance of a priest, though I attempted to reach the parish priest. I offered to have the family, the siblings, the grandparents, the parents, the uncles, anoint their baby. We went through the home looking for vessels for oil. Mom had her mother's set of individual butter plates. Every family member had their own vessel with olive oil. They told stories of their family and their love for their baby, what had been added to their lives by having her in it, and each family member there anointed this child. So in summary, we know that seriously ill and dying children have spiritual experiences. The question is, are we listening? Are we present? Are we impacting systems of care so that if any child dies in an emergency room, in ICU, wherever it might be, in your state and in your community, is there awareness? Is there someone asking the questions? Is there someone there to listen to the stories of the angels in the room and not telling the child that they aren't there? These are the challenges for us. We need support to enhance our own communication skills, including listening and presence and language. And we need to work closely with our colleagues, including chaplains, as our spiritual care experts to provide this care. And I end with just these lovely words from a chaplain who wrote this just incredible paper back in 1989 on the spiritual needs of dying children. She said, "For who but children can show us so much about the reality of human life? Their skin is thin, like plastic wrap, revealing a delicate system of vital tissues beneath it. Their breathing is shallow and frequent, revealing the primordial struggle that all living things have to receive the breath of life. Their hands and feet are fashioned with tiny details, revealing their dependence on other, stronger hands for survival. Their hearts beat with a powerful incessancy, revealing that even though they appear weak, They have a great will to live. Their faces have wonderful details displayed in countless expressions, revealing the uniqueness of each individual and the potential that each has to have a long and abundant life. Their spirit is alive, revealing an immediate ability to respond to love and offer love in return, revealing that each is an incarnation of God's love. Who but children can show us so much about what it means to be human, revealing that all of us are rather fragile creatures, struggling for life, trying to fulfill our potential, expressing our uniqueness, living in relationship with God. And who but children can so easily reveal how the fragile balance of life can be disrupted. The care of all seriously ill children is sacred work, and we are fortunate to support this journey. All children, those who will be cured of their disease, those who will survive many years, and those who will die, deserve quality care. And quality care will always mean spiritual care. So with that, I need to shift to the other slides. And so I'm wondering, Greg, if you might take this microphone, and while I'm shifting, maybe just see if there are a couple of people in the room who would like to comment on their work in spiritual care of children. Sure.
What about you sharing?
Yeah, it was a trick. I gave him the microphone.
Yeah, right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Betty, very much. So I've been doing this work for a while now, and I've worked with some really amazing clinicians in my time, and two stories came to mind as you were talking, Betty, and one of them was when I worked as a nurse at Maine Medical Center. Before there was a Barbara Bush, there was a pediatric unit called P2CD, and we had a little 5-year-old girl there who was dying. She had rhabdomyosarcoma, actually, and had a lovely family that was present with her all the time. And she told all of us, she was very keen on telling everybody who came into the room about a week before she died, that she was going to be have a tree planted over her when she died. That was like her. She was very excited about that, and made sure that everybody knew that. And her parents were just blown away by this. They had not expected their daughter to kind of be so forthcoming and so okay with that, you know? It was really incredible. And the other story that came to my mind, her name was Hannah, by the way. The other story that came to my mind was a doctor that I used to work with that many of you might remember, Craig Hurwitz, who was an oncologist, pediatric oncologist here in Maine, at Maine Children's Cancer Program, and my time working with him. He attended a death one time, and this kind of speaks to the power of that we possess as clinicians that we actually don't know we have, and that is that the parents, even though Craig was Jewish, the parents really wanted Craig to baptize their child as he was dying, and he said it was, you know, it's the most powerful thing that had ever happened to him in his career until that point. And so really, it's amazing that power that we have, and that presence is so very important. And sometimes that's all we have. Mm-hmm. As you were saying, Betty, about Dame Cicely Saunders, you know, we weren't creating a system where we could just give morphine. We were creating a system that allowed for those moments and that time. And sometimes all we have are not the drugs in our toolbox or the therapies in our toolbox, but our presence. And that's so very important. So.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to share about pediatrics?
That's great. Hi, I'm Elizabeth, and and I had the privilege of working with children through a pediatric hospice and palliative care program in Baltimore. And I'll just tell you one story about RJ. We would invite children to put on their hospital room some things like their favorite color, their friend, etc. His friend was Frog, and I'm not sure if he made this up himself, but Frog stood for faithfully rely on God. So God was his best friend. He would tell us that he saw angels in his room. And as you mentioned, this was very upsetting to his mother. But we were able to talk with him about it. And the priest said, RJ, I've never seen an angel. What do they look like? And he said, they're beyond beautiful. They fit in this room like a puzzle. And one of them is always with me. The others come and go. And his mother, as you referred to, said, stop. No, I don't want any angels in this room, RJ. And he said, no, Mom, you don't have to worry. The angels are here to try to heal me. When it's my time, Jesus will come for me. His mother had a really hard time even to acknowledge that that might happen. But when she did, he had it all planned out. He said, okay, so no flowers at my funeral. That's for girls. I want to wear my white coat that Johns Hopkins gave me as my medical coat as an honorary doctor. I want there to be stuffed animals, and then you give them back to the children at Hopkins. And so just to end that, at his birthday, which was about 6 months later, his mother was really distressed. What should we do? I said, let's do something to celebrate his life. So she decided to bring another round of stuffed animals to the kids. And we also had balloons. So she ended up coming, I kid you not, she had to rent a U-Haul trailer because that's how many stuffed animals the community donated. And then we let off balloons. There was a red and a blue and a Mylar one that said, God loves you, because she didn't feel she could do happy birthday. So we let them off. They lived about 2.5 hours away on the eastern shore of Maryland. The next day she calls me and she's like, that was beautiful, that was so good, and I'm feeling good now. I'm like, that was a good suggestion. 2 hours later, she calls me, she's hysterical. I can't even understand her, so she puts her teenage daughter on the phone. I said, what's happening? She said, Elizabeth, we just went down the street where we used to live, and there, caught in a tree across from our house, is a red and a blue balloon, and a balloon that says, God loves you. And for them, that was a sign that RJ was with them and would always be there for them.
Beautiful. Thank you. Beautiful. Thank you so much. Wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you all. And I hope over lunch and throughout the day that you continue to share your stories and, your thoughts. And, Greg, your story about the oncologist, who had the mother say, to the Jewish oncologist, will you anoint my child? I remember clearly many, many years ago, I was called to see a woman who was in our town, and she had left home, and about the time she arrived to attend one of our conferences, actually, she had left home from a rural community in the South, and her husband, who was a farmer and had never traveled ever gone out of town with her. But he had said to her about a week before this conference, I want to come with you. And she thought, well, that's just crazy. You've never been on a plane, and why would you want to travel? But she'd said to him, no, don't, that's great. I'd love to go on a vacation, but don't come with me on this because I'll be busy in the class. So she got on a plane, flew to our course, arrived, and got a phone call that her husband was out working with a wood chipper and putting in the trees, and his arm got caught, and he went through his body, went through this device, so that she's getting this call. So I was called to come and be with her, and as I went to her, I was doing sort of my usual, sit, let me get you water, a cold cloth, we're going to make an airline reservation, we're going to get you home. I'm doing all of these things. And I remember saying, I'm here to do anything you need. How can I help you? And she looked right into my eyes and said, pray with me. And I will always remember that moment because I thought, yes, I will pray with you. But I thought, What if I wasn't prepared for that moment, right? What if I couldn't do the one thing that mattered to her? And so that's been kind of an inspiration to me that all of us need to be prepared. Whether that is, that can happen in many ways, right? Would you like to pray and I will be with you? Or, tell me about your faith and what you would pray for. Or I will call a chaplain to join us. But we all need to be present. If we are going to do the work of serious illness, we all need to be ready for spiritual care in whatever form that may be, right? So I think I just don't know how you can be in hospice and palliative care and not be well prepared to provide spiritual care. So thank you all for sharing your stories. What I want to do now with our remaining time is to say a little bit about our work in more the adult world. And what I'll be sharing with you actually comes from work that I do with Christina Polchowski. Some of you may know Christina. She's a physician in Washington, D.C. And Christina started something called GWISH. And GWISH is the George Washington Institute for Spirituality and Health, which has done a tremendous amount of work of getting spirituality in medical schools and also just promoting spiritual assessment and spiritual care. And so Christina and I together have created a curriculum to teach professionals across disciplines spiritual care called ISPEC, the International Spiritual Care Education Curriculum. And if you want more information about this, the GWISH website, so just www.gwish.org, there's lots of information, including the courses that we hold to teach professionals. There's a course coming up in November, which will be virtual, and it is what we're trying to do in these courses is to have chaplains and other clinicians come together. So like a chaplain and social worker, a chaplain physician, chaplain nurse come together because we're trying to really promote this partnership of chaplains and clinicians working together to improve spiritual care. And also, I just want to say that I asked someone about my slides, and the slides of both of my presentations will be available through when the video is created online. And so everything I've shared with you today, then you're welcome to access online once that's available. So this is our work in ISPEC, and I'm just going to share sort of some of the key messages that we are trying to convey to all kinds of settings, hospice and palliative care, but really every setting of care. If you're sick enough to be in the hospital, if you're sick enough to be in a clinic, then spirituality, is a part of who you are. And so we should all be really attentive to spiritual needs. So we want to do things like help people recognize the importance of spirituality and what role it plays in serious illness and what is the evidence base and define aspects of spirituality and then the role of all of us. So we all are familiar with the whole spiritual, the generalist specialist notion in palliative care, right? That many of us in this room are specialists in palliative care. We've certification or training or this is our daily work. But people that work in oncology and ICUs and EDs and other people also need palliative care knowledge as generalists. And the same is true when it comes to spiritual care. Our chaplains, our spiritual care providers are our specialists, but every one of us has the obligation. If I'm going to be a good nurse, I need to know how to assess spiritual needs and respond to spiritual needs, right? So we talk about sort of, just what are the needs that people of all ages are living with serious chronic diseases, cancer, diabetes, renal failure, et cetera. And just like you heard last night, we are here to care for whole people. You chose to go into this work of hospice and palliative care because you wanted to care for the whole person. And so it's critical that we also really learn about spiritual care. We know that patients want to have their spirituality assessed. Balboni and her colleagues in Boston have done tremendous work surveying thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And all of the studies show that, again, spirituality varies tremendously. And spirituality for some people might be their Buddhist faith or as a Hindu or as a Catholic, as some identified religion. But for many people, their spirituality may be their work, right? I talk to a lot of people who say, well, I'm not really religious, but then they tell me their stories that are the most deeply spiritual things I have ever heard. I had many people who, for example, a history professor who just was adamant, there was no God, and that it couldn't be possible, and that he had no religious affiliation. But then he talked deeply about the work he had done, and the students that he had guided, and the books that he had written, and the people carrying on his work. And so listening to his story of the meaning of his life and his legacy was the spiritual intervention that he needed. And so spirituality varies amongst everyone, but what is important is that we don't ignore it. So again, you're going to get these slides, and there's far more in them than I can possibly share in our little bit of time this morning. But what I wanted to really share with you is that this isn't just my opinion. It's not just my friend Christina's opinion. The World Health Organization and most other major health communities have defined health. The meaning of health includes spiritual well-being. So the International Health Congress, the WHO, all of these groups have said that we are spiritual beings. This comes from the amazing work that started our field by Cicely Saunders and Dancel Macy and Barnum and others who said, let's have a different way to think about healthcare, and that is the biopsychosocial spiritual model, that I come to you with my diabetes or cancer or heart failure, and I want you to see me as a whole person, as a person that has psychological and social issues, but also as a spiritual being. And when it comes to spirituality, I always say we define spirituality with what I call the broad brush, right? That spirituality is meaning. What has your life meant? It is purpose. It is dignity. It is hope. It is faith. It is community. It is connection. It is often forgiveness. And it is gratitude. I could spend days talking about this topic of forgiveness, but just to kind of give you an example, many years ago, I did probably what's one of my favorite studies of my whole career, which was a study of forgiveness. And I basically asked about 150 nurses, tell me a story of a time that you were with a patient who expressed issues of forgiveness, right? Tell me the story. So the stories were amazing, amazing. So story after story after story, the patient would tell stories. A lot of the stories were from veterans. The person was in the hospital with their cancer, or their heart failure, or their COPD, but the story they were saying was, 60 years ago, I was in Korea, I killed people, I came home, I have never spoken a word. I have been married for 50 years, and I have never even told we're good. Yep. Okay. I've never even talked to my wife about this, but now I'm dying, and I need to tell someone I killed people, right? So the stories were amazing, amazing stories of addiction, abuse, amazing stories. And so I had the nurses tell me these stories, and then I said to the nurses, what did you do? How did you respond? And what do you think most nurses said after hearing these incredible stories? They said, it's okay, no problem, right? It's done, fixed, right? Let me put it in a box, put a big bow on it, you're good, right? It is our inclination to want to fix things. And so what did the patients really need? They needed somebody to pull up a chair and say, tell me more. What was that like for you? Tell me about all the nights you've laid in bed and seen the faces of the people you killed, right? Tell me what this feels like to know that your life is ending and that you are meeting your maker, having done this thing that you find to really be defining your life, right? So even those of us who have good intentions, right, often don't have the skills to be there and to be fully present and to listen to the issues of spiritual care. And I have certainly learned a lot from that myself and consider myself still a learner in how to listen to stories and provide spiritual care. So again, many documents from many groups that have emphasized that spiritual care should be a part of what we do, spiritual support and counseling, addressing spiritual needs. So this is the definition I also shared with you earlier in the pediatric world. It was came from a conference we convened about a little over 20 years ago now, where we brought together 20 leaders in the world of theology and then 20 leaders in the world of palliative care. And we put them in a room and said, we are not letting you out until you all agree on a definition of spirituality. And so from that came this lively, wonderful discussion, and this was the definition that came from that spirituality is a dynamic and intrinsic part of humanity through which persons seek ultimate meaning, purpose, and transcendence, and experience relationship to self, family, others, community, society, nature, and the significant or sacred. And spirituality is expressed through our beliefs, values, traditions, and practices. One of my other favorite studies we did was about 110 patients who we asked this question, tell us about your spirituality. Of those 110 people, again, I asked the question, tell me about spirituality. I thought I was going to hear about the relationship with God or a higher power, or meaning. And of the 110, I think about 90 began to talk about their family, right? What is my spirituality? Well, it means I'm a good father, right? And then they would talk all about what it meant to be a good father, right? And it was so beautiful to think that spirituality is often about relationships, right? About relationships with the people around you. And so it also meant what an opportunity to sit and to say, tell me more about what that means to be a good father. What does that mean, right? And to really let this person talk about being a good father and what goodness meant in their life. And certainly spirituality can include religion and other worldviews, but it's far bigger than just religion. It may be arts, it may be nature, it may be through humanism, but for each person we need to hear their story of what spirituality is. We do know, and our national guidelines for palliative care emphasize that spiritual care is an essential component. It is that we need to include spiritual screening, history, and assessment, and that we have professional standards. So again, this is from around the world. Again, recognize this is from the Health Service in Scotland, that I love this, spiritual care begins with encouraging human contact in compassionate relationship and moves in whatever direction need requires. Every person is different. We also know that care is provided by our chaplains, more and more board certified chaplains and even palliative care certified chaplains, and they are our specialists. So in many countries, chaplains are referred to as the spiritual caregivers and the people that have education and training beyond the scope of the practice of other clinicians. So just to briefly touch base, there's a ton of evidence, right? We all want to practice evidence-based care. We want evidence-based practice for pain management, for bereavement programs, and we want an evidence-based for our spiritual care practice. And so there's a large and growing body of literature. A couple of months ago, I was a part of a paper published in JAMA led by Tracy Balboni and her group in Boston that synthesized all the literature from the last 20 years in the area of spirituality. And what this evidence base shows is that spirituality is fundamental, it's basic, it is a part of our patients' and families' lives. And the question is, are we listening? Are we assessing? There's a growing body of evidence that tending to spiritual needs impacts other aspects of quality of life. How many times have we seen the patient that we've said, oh, this person's very, very anxious, or this person is very depressed, or we don't know how to get this person's pain under control. And yet, when we did a spiritual assessment or involved our chaplain in the care of this patient, we realized that the distress was spiritual distress, right? I could tell you 100 stories of the patients that I've been asked to see who, at the heart of their uncontrolled pain, their prolonged death, their depression, their angst, was an unmet spiritual need. And so all of us need to be attuned to these needs. Lots of studies that associate spiritual well-being with all kinds of other outcomes that we're interested in. And things like depression and anxiety, as I've mentioned, coping, social functioning, relationships, et cetera. So lots of data here. We'll just kind of jump over. But this is, again, a study, 230 people with cancer. 68% said religion or spirituality was very important, and another 20% at least somewhat important. And for the 12% who did not find spirituality important, I would venture to say that there were other aspects of their lives that I would call spirituality that were important: their legacy, their meaning, their purpose, their work, their love of nature, that there's some other aspect that is important. And again, just a lot of data here. So what are patients' needs? Patients have a need for connection, to feel that they aren't alone. A sense of peace. There's a researcher at Duke, Karen Steinhauser, and she's done all kinds of spiritual assessment scales, but Karen developed a one-item scale, and her one-item scale says, "Are you at peace?" And so at the bedside, then many institutions and palliative care teams and programs ask that one item, "Are you at peace?" as a way of opening the door to, are there needs that we can address? Tell me about your sense of peace. Meaning and purpose. What is the meaning, the reality of your life? And transcendence, of strengthening spiritual beliefs or communication with a higher being. Meditation is often very, very important, to participate in meditation or listening to music, viewing art. Like, there's so many ways that we can help people connect. In the same way that we connected with our souls in listening to the flute, there are many, many ways that patients can connect with their inner being. We know there are a lot of barriers, that there are reasons why we don't provide the best spiritual care. One of the things that I often say is that I think a high percentage of clinicians that I know are allergic to spirituality, because they become highly anxious, break out in hives, are confident that their pager's going off and they need to leave the room, but many behaviors that make them very nervous when the word spirituality happens. And so we need to help our colleagues, right? We need to do training, everyone on our team. And I do mean everyone on our team. I started my career, before my 45 years in nursing, I was a housekeeper in the hospital. So I went, room to room, cleaning the toilets, cleaning the patient's room. I was, I think, 19 years old. And as I went room to room, I had total access. I mean, talk about a position of power. I had total access to every room in the hospital. I was totally invisible. So no one asked me what I was doing. So I went room to room, ICU, oncology, everywhere in the hospital. And in every room, I'm here to tell you, patients told me everything. And I will also assure you, I freely delivered advice. Freely. I was also the person who got the Snickers bar for them out of the closet, and I was the first opinion. The doctors never knew they were the second opinion. But I was in shock when I became a nurse then a year or two later to realize how much patients didn't tell me, right? So the housekeepers, the nursing assistants, in the midst of a bed bath, a tremendous amount of spiritual assessment happens, right? And so we need everyone. Again, I could tell you 1,000 stories of one of my favorite patients ever was a physician who was absolutely angry that what kind of deal was this, that after being a doctor who had spent his whole life caring for patients, that now he was the patient at the cancer center, and he was very angry. And he was Jewish, And when he met his wife and married her 40 years ago, they had different faiths, and so they had agreed that both would abandon their faiths, that there would be practice of no faith in their home. Their children would never be raised in a faith tradition, so they would never have a conflict. And so now this man, 40 years later, is facing his death and really thinking about this abandoning his faith. He told me very clearly to not send the chaplain because it would just send his wife over the edge. But it happened that the aide from radiology who came to take him to radiation every day was Jewish. And so who became his rabbi? Right. So we need our nursing assistants, we need our transporters, we need everyone to be involved in spiritual care. We're sort of just about out of time, so I'm just going to kind of skip through a couple of things just to say that there's a tremendous amount of work that has been done in this whole area of integrating spiritual care as a part of palliative care. This was a consensus conference that we led to try to move this forward in palliative care. And then I would just direct everyone to our national guidelines, because these NCP guidelines do have as one of the 8 domains spiritual, religious, and existential aspects. And again, the challenge I would leave all of you with is you're all here because you came to this meeting because you want to provide the best home care, hospice care, palliative care possible. And my message is that if you leave this domain out, you will not provide the best quality care. So everyone should be committed to improving spiritual care. I'm going to stop now just so we have the last 5 minutes for any questions or comments. And then again, when you get the videos and the slides, then my slide handout has a lot more information to direct you. And again, you can always contact me. There's so many resources out there to help you improve spiritual care. So I'll stop now and see if there are any questions or comments. We have about 5 minutes.
Hi, I'm Annie Blanchard. I was just remembering a case that Greg and I had years ago. It was a cystic fibrosis client who died at home, and I wanted to just comment on the funeral director. The funeral home that came to pick her up, instead of putting her in a body bag, actually picked her up in his own hands and brought her out to the car. And I just wanted to give a kudos to the funeral directors out there that are helping with this too.
Absolutely. That's beautiful. Yeah. Beautiful.
To what extent does spiritual care extend to include the caregiver and possibly, part of the family?
So the caregiver, as in the nurses, physicians, social workers,
How about
or
the
Right.
family member
Yeah.
who has also
Yeah,
a life
absolutely.
history
Yes,
that may
absolutely.
be, and
Yeah.
I'm very curious about that.
Well, I think it goes back to what do we believe? What is the foundation of our work, right? And so from day one, when the field of hospice was developed, and then when the field of palliative care followed, like a basic foundation of our field is family-centered care. Like we never go into the room and say, okay, who's the guy with the diagnosis, right? We always, whether it's in the hospital or at home, we always say, who are you? Who is your family? And I'll tell you a lesson that I've learned is that the patient's spiritual needs may be extremely different than the family caregiver's spiritual needs. And you saw that with the children, with the work with the children, that there are many, many of these young parents were not interested in religion, and yet the children were very interested, in religion, right, in spirituality. And so we have to think about that people are at sort of, really different places. And it's really common, for a patient to maybe be at a place of peace and to really be seeking, prayer or spiritual, reading scripture or visiting with a chaplain. And the family still may be mad, right? Really angry. And somewhere between there is no God, because how could a God do something so bad as to take my good husband? Or just outright angry, right? Like there is a God and I'm really mad at him, right? So they may be at really different places. And I will tell you, I do a lot of studies of patients and family caregivers, and one of the things we've learned is that we often ask the patient, would you like to see the chaplain? And now we try to always make sure that we ask the family member separately. And many times I have family members who say, I would like to see the chaplain. My husband does not, but I need the chaplain. And so I think always we should be providing family-centered care, which includes spirituality, but also be aware that the needs of the family members may be really different than the patient. Way back here, Greg.
Betty, what about this family? This family, you talk about the clinical guidelines, and of course, in the structure of care, we're to care for ourselves, the first domain.
Right.
And so I don't know, I'm called in this moment. There are many people in the room. One woman came up to me last night and said, you knew Shelby. So I want to, in this moment, I want everybody who knew Shelby Dickinson to stand up. She was a hospice social worker. Stand up if you knew Shelby. She's a hospice social worker. And she worked for us, and she died suddenly with an aneurysm about 5 weeks after having her baby. And we lost her. Those of us in this room lost her. And I think, thank you, you can sit down if you want. And I want to tell that story because it fits with the spiritual piece. When I had her family come in, some people know this story, when I had her family come in, we were talking and having our time together. And we went up to a place where Shelby sat and all her things were there. And we went back downstairs to the room where we were talking. And her mother looked down on the floor, and right in the doorway where we had walked through was a bobby pin. And she immediately said, there's your sign, to her husband. She is here. Spirituality came in the form of a bobby pin. What's most remarkable is after I got COVID, I went off to a place to try to capture myself, and it was on the ground, taking my bicycle out of the car, in a dirt was a bobby pin. And I heard her words, seek the joy. And then I went home another time, and I have an altar there, and I was praying in my own way. And I had, underneath the altar, I was sweeping one day, underneath the altar, I found another bobby pin. And what message was she trying to say? And she comes to us in all kinds of ways. One of our other social workers just had a baby, and her mother was very worried about her mother, meaning Shelby's mother, and checking in on her. And she was feeding her baby the other day, and there was a dragonfly with golden wings that came to sit by her. And Shelby was very inspirational in our Camp Dragonfly for children. So I tell these stories because it fits with caring for our team. We lost someone we love, and who was dedicated to palliative care, was 30 years old and seeking leadership in that. We lost her, and I just wanted to tell that the signs of Shelby show up all the time.
Right.
And I wanted to do it in this realm. Thank you for the time to do that.
Yeah, we teach spiritual care in all of our element courses. We teach spiritual care, and I often do the breakout session on spirituality. We get a room full of nurses in the room, and then I say, so, how are you doing? How are you doing spiritual care? Silence, right? Silence. And then generally somebody will speak up and say, well, I don't even know about my own spirituality. How can I help somebody else? And it's like, bingo, right? Because if we are not in tune with our own spirituality, if we are not caring for ourselves, providing spiritual care to ourselves and our teams and our communities, how can we possibly provide it to other people? So just a couple quick things. One is we, in many of our courses, we have this self-care assessment that we give out to all the clinicians. And it's a very simple, it takes like 5 minutes, but it's a little assessment that says, how are you doing with kind of healthy, eating or activity, or, setting some limits on work, et cetera. And so people go through and they do this self-assessment, and all of the time, particularly a lot of young nurses, they'll say, oh, I run 5 miles a day after my 12-hour ICU shift, and I'm eating healthy salads, whatever. And then it gets to the spirituality section, 0. They're doing nothing, right? And so I do think absolutely that each of us, if you're going to do this work, you won't survive unless you have your own spiritual plan, right? And that can be meditation, it can be music, it could be running, it can be whatever, but you do need to have a plan. You have to be in touch with your own spirituality to, I think, be an effective provider. And so it needs to be part of self-care. It needs to be part of community. I don't know if you all do things like the blessing of the hands. We frequently will have, the chaplains go unit by unit or into agencies and do a ritual of blessing the hands of the providers. And I think in doing that, I've watched it, we do a blessing of the hands at many of our courses. And when we bless the hands of people in the room, there is this stark moment where they realize, what? You just said I was a sacred person? Like my hands are doing sacred work? And so just reminding people that they are a vessel of sacred work is so important. So yes, spirituality has to be a part of our communities and our personal lives to do this work. I know I've gone a little bit over, and so I'm going to stop now. I'll be around all day. I appreciate your interest. Yeah?
Just really quickly, folks, I just wanted to say this real quick. And, since I was a little boy, I've had heroes in my life. So, like Bobby Orr and Carl Yastrzemski and, later on Neil Young and, folks like that. But I've known Betty for 20 years, and truly, this woman is my hero. So thank you.